The upcoming test or this test?
Pardon me?
The upcoming test?
Yeah, the one for Wednesday.
Wednesday?
Okay, that's gonna be your first test, 50 questions, and it's gonna cover the summaries, chapters 1, 2, 3, and the full textbook reading, chapter 4, 5, 6, and 7. We've gone over chapter 4 last time, we're doing chapter 5 today. Follow. Next Monday, chapter 6, next Wednesday, the test. Bring your Scantron cards for the test. Everybody clear? You should be checking all of this out before you come to class. There's a calendar in your syllabus. You follow the calendar day by day for each class. What's your name, last name? Okay. Any other questions? Those of you who submitted your essay on Friday, I would say 80% of you really did well. Very good. Okay, insightful, interesting, well written. Okay. Way to go. So now remember, you have another essay discussion assignment on this coming Friday. Deadline is midnight. And you can do it anytime between now and then. Okay, any questions? Questions? Okay, we're going to go over very briefly chapter 5. When the so-called patriots, I call them insurgents, Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, when they finally won the American Revolution, they wanted to create a new kind of government, a government without a king in charge. That's an old medieval thing, and they didn't want it because they kicked Fat George out. They didn't want any more interference from the British government, so they had to invent and create a new government. A government without a king, and that's called a republic. That's the definition of a country that's not ruled by a king. Okay, got it? Now, they had some ideas in their heads about what kind of government they wanted. How to create this new government called a republic. And this is what was in their heads. At the time, there were essentially two theories of government. One theory was what the British rule was all about, which they didn't like and rejected, and fought a revolution over. And that was that most of the political power and governmental power, when they were a colony of Great Britain, was concentrated in London. And they didn't have any representation in that government. So when you have concentrated power in one place, that's called centralized government. Today, Washington, D.C. is centralized government. That's what you have today. Okay, but without a king, because it's a republic. This is not a democracy as they set it up. It's a constitutional republic, not a democracy. They didn't like democracy. They considered it ruled by mobs of people. Mobocracy is what they called it. They didn't want any democracy. They gave it a little bit, which I'll get into, but not a lot. So if that centralized government in one place, in that case it was London, was headed by one person, that was called a monarchy, a king. Sometimes it's called a dictatorship. You getting this, this idea? Now this was all done in the medieval times, okay? And from the perspective of the rebels, Jefferson, Washington, those guys won. That was tyranny. That was oppressive. They were forcing rules and laws onto people in the colonies that weren't in the interests of those people. And they considered that, and they called it tyranny. So what's in their heads when they try to invent this new government is they don't like political power in one place because they felt it created dictatorships. One person rule, that's oppressive. Okay? They didn't like that. They wanted to take governmental and political power and spread it out so that not one person would have all the power. Okay? That's why they fought the revolution. So that is known as decentralized government. And without a king, it's called a republic. Thank you, sir. Anybody not sign this? Everybody okay? I'll bring it to you. It's okay. My guess is what it is. Thank you. You're welcome. First name first, last name. Then bring that up, please. And they felt that that would create more liberty for each person. Diffuse, spread out power, okay? Don't have a king. And each individual, therefore, will have more liberty and not fall under the yoke of an oppressive tyranny government headed by a king. That was their idea. That's what they set out to do. Now, again, this is different from government, this lecture. Government just tells you what they did, First Amendment, Second Amendment, you gotta memorize all of that stuff. What I'm trying to do is give you the historical context of why they did what they did, so you'll understand that stuff better. And that's what this lecture is about. Well, what the hell was in their heads? What were they thinking? What was their point of view? Where were they coming from? So this is what they had in mind. Not one big centralized government, but spread political power out to who? To the state governments. Massachusetts, New York, Virginia should have all of the power, not one place. Now, if they came back today and they saw what was going on in Washington, D.C., they would be horrified. That's not what they set out to do. They wanted the states, each individual states, to have more power than the national government. Because they were afraid that over time, the national government would create more and more power for itself and become tyrannical. Okay? Okay, so sign your sheet here, please. First name, last name. Everybody got all of this? So this is exactly opposite of what you were born into. Okay. Over the last 200 years, things have changed to the extent where we now have this without king instead of this. Got it? So you got to change your thinking in order to understand this section. Everybody following? I hope so. So far. Question? Your question. So one of the things they tried to create was something called federalism, sharing power between the states and the national government. That's called federalism. The national government doesn't have all the power, the states have power, and the national government also has power. And they're going to share power, spread out the power, diffuse it. So federalism, again, you should have copied all of this down before the lecture, because I'm not going to take a lot of time waiting for you to copy this down. I don't have it. Federalism, power shared between the national government and, in this case, the states, Massachusetts, New York, etc. And in order to make sure the national government did not acquire power over time, they said in the Constitution that the national government will only have the power that we write into the Constitution, nothing else. Hey, Article 1, Section 1, Article 1, Section 2, enumerated powers. That's all you get, national government. The powers, the rest of the powers stay with the states. Why are they called states? When those original 13 colonies got independent from Great Britain, they called themselves states, which we still call them. Why? Because they felt they were separate individual countries. They were like Germany, they were like France, they were like Italy, separate countries. States. You getting all of this? They didn't want the national government to have a lot of power. They said, no more. We're going to diffuse power, and it's going to be shared by the national government, and only what's in the Constitution is the only thing they get. The rest of it stays with the states. That's called federalism. Yes, sir.
If if all the states felt that they were individual countries, why did they have an interest in forming a national government in the first place?
I'm going to get to that.
Oh, okay,
Just
sorry.
No, it's fine. It's great. Just be patient. So this diagram is trying to show you what federalism is. There is a national government. It's in one place as they set it up. In this case, it was in New York City. At first, there wasn't any Washington, D.C. The national capital was New York City. And then there were states, and they shared powers. Federalism. Okay, everybody clear on that? Question? Now, the next thing they did to make sure that this new national government that they were creating, they didn't call it the federal government at that time, we do. They called it the national government. They wanted to divide its powers too, so they wouldn't all be lumped together in order to spread power out even within the national government. So they created three branches. A legislative branch that makes the laws, we call it Congress. An executive branch that enforces the law, the president. And the judicial branch that interprets the laws, the judges, the Supreme Court. You see how everything is dividing the power so that it doesn't get concentrated in one place. That was their whole idea. And they felt that the more they did that, the more you would have liberty. And me. Any questions on any of this? You see, this is why you have the government you have today. They were very fearful of concentrated power because they had lived under what they considered to be oppressive British rule, and they wanted to do the opposite thing. So even the federal government was supposed to have divided powers.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Since the judicial branch interprets, but the legislature makes them,
Yeah.
so why would... Let me think on the question. It's just,
Yeah, it's okay.
let me back to
Think
you.
about it. Yeah, you're thinking, that's good. I can hear the brain, the gears in the brain moving, and it's fine.
So how would the judicial branch know what the laws or what the legislation, or why were they created? Like, why would the...
Yeah, come on. It's okay.
All right. So if we have, I don't see why we would need the judicial branch as interpreters if the legislative branch make the laws and
Because
say
there's
everything.
always going to be someone who challenges the law. Always. Always. You make a law, okay? Very few laws are voted unanimously in the legislature, right? Today in Congress, they're divided all over the place. So groups bring lawsuits against the law to try to have some more balanced third party, the judicial branch, interpret the law to say, yes, it's constitutional, it's legal, or no, goodbye, make a new law.
Supreme Courts.
That's the power of the judicial branch. So the judicial branch today has the power, Supreme Court and the federal courts, there's federal courts too, has the power to declare this branch's laws unconstitutional. They can't be put into effect. And if the Supreme Court says that, okay, hey, you can't do that, and they do it anyway, this guy is supposed to stop the legislative branch. See, separation of powers. Okay? That's what the way it's supposed to work. Seldom does, but it's the way it's supposed to work. That was the theory. Okay, interesting, right? So when people say, you know, our form of government is very inefficient, they're always arguing with each other, there's a lot of conflict and divisions, that's what they put into effect. They knew that, but they wanted to keep one branch, one government, from getting one person from getting too much power. So they wanted them to argue. They wanted to debate. And then they wanted them to compromise. I'll give you a little, you take a little, I'll take a little, I'll give you a little. That was their intent. Okay? I find this really interesting. And the reason they did this is because they understood human nature. They understood there's always going to be grasping for power, there's always going to be conflict, and they created an arena, political arena, within which that could take place without people shooting each other. And then, to also spread it out, they created a system of checks and balances so that no one branch would have all the power. So, as far as, I'll just give you a couple of examples. There are more in the handout. The judicial branch, for example, has to be appointed by the president. He or she appoints the people that are going to be on the Supreme Court. And then it has to be approved, that appointment has to be approved by the legislative branch. So he can't control the Supreme Court with his appointments, because then the legislative branch could not approve that person. Checks and balances. Everybody follow that? And again, critics of the system say, gee, this is so inefficient, so argument prone. Maybe we should go back to a monarchy. And most Americans say, no, we like it like this. Because then the president can't become a dictator by appointing all the members of the Supreme Court to do what he or she wants them to do. They're supposed to be independent, in theory. Questions so far? That's called checks and balances. Now I give you, in the handout at the bottom, U.S. Constitution, down here, I say what the executive branch does and how it checks the legislative branch and how the legislative branch checks the judicial branch. Know these for the test. Okay. They'll be on you. Ordinarily, you're supposed to know this stuff. Hopefully you already do. How many of you taken government, political science so far? Okay, good, great. You know there's a lot happening. Now, there's always attempts to overturn this stuff, and that's what the political arena is supposed to argue over, debate over, and then the American people are supposed to decide which way to go. They're all in theory. Any questions about that? So it's a system of power sharing, again, that allows each branch to stop or modify the actions of another branch to prevent any one branch from gaining too much power, and its purpose is to encourage compromise. You can't have it all. We'll give you a little bit, okay? But that's it. Now, this is going on every day today in Washington, D.C. Every single day. You notice I'm not saying who's right, who's wrong about what's going on today. I'm just trying to give you an overview, a balanced overview. Whatever your political predilections may be. Okay, questions, comments, anything? Now, I would never run for political office, okay? Because it's fearful. The opposition tries to tear you apart. They do character assassination. They try to tell everybody how lousy you are and, you know, that you're fooling around, you know, with women or with men, or you're taking bribes, whatever. Follow? I would never put myself into that position. But there are some people who have a will to power and they want power. And this whole system is designed to keep them restrained. Compromise, yes. Dictatorship, tyranny, no. Play the game the way it's been set up. Okay, your next learning objective is to describe how the creation of the Electoral College, the impeachment process, and the procedure to amend the Constitution try to protect the Constitution itself from being changed too drastically, okay? When you see the word radical, that means extreme, okay? Extreme. So they wanted the Constitution somehow to be protected from people who would want to overturn the system too drastically and maybe create a dictatorship in the process. Okay. In about 250 years, that's how long it's been in effect, the Constitution, with one exception. We'll get to that at the end of the course.
Marshall?
It's the longest running Constitution in all of human history. They were successful. So let's go through these three things that are very controversial to this day. The first one being the Electoral College. This is in the Constitution. If you want to get rid of the Electoral College, and a lot of people do, they don't like it today, they have to change the Constitution, because it's in there, and it's in there for a purpose. So they created this, what they call the college. It's basically a group of people who actually elect the president. The individual citizens don't elect the president, according to the Constitution. They feared mobocracy. So they wanted upstanding, upright citizens, people who have proven virtue, people who would put the country's interest above their own special interest for the good of the country. Leaders of the societies, leaders in Virginia, leaders in New York, who were outstanding citizens, people. They're supposed to be the ones who occupy the so-called Electoral College. It's not really a college, it's just a name. They don't have one. It's not ACC where you come to a building, okay? And they basically, those people, basically vote for who the president will be. Because the big fear was the president would be commander-in-chief of the military, and as such would have tremendous power. So how do you keep that person in check? Because they could just throw the Congress out, they could throw the Supreme Court out, they could send the army in, and you have a dictatorship. They're the commander-in-chief. So one of the ways was to create an electoral college so that one person, say Donald Trump, I'm just bringing him up as an example, not that I hate him, not that I love him, just as an example, can't order the military to shut down the legislature. Okay? Now, the Electoral College did vote for him, so it's possible he could have done it when he was president if he so chose. But he didn't so choose. Okay? That was the idea. Okay? Be careful of who you elect. Don't leave it up to the people. It's too important. Leave it up to the country's best citizens. Now, a lot of people don't like that. They consider it undemocratic. But remember, this wasn't supposed to be a democracy. This is a constitutional republic. And how do you keep it a republic? They thought this was one of the ways to do that. So they felt that well-informed, conscientious electors who look to the good of the country, not their own self-interests, would be the ideal people to vote for president. Small group of people. Now, who should they be? Well, remember, the states should have most of the power, not the national government. So the idea was, we'll let the state legislatures appoint these people. You don't vote for them. To this day, you don't vote for the electors. Okay. The way it was set up, the national, each state government would appoint members to the Electoral College to vote for a president, in order for the states to keep having power and not have the national government grab it all. So a constant idea of sharing of power, suspicion of democracy, keep dividing power. So they were appointed by each state legislature, these people, and that was part of federalism and power sharing. Now, the number of people in the Electoral College is based on the state's membership in the House and in the Senate. Okay. Each state has a vote. Okay. Members of the Electoral College represent that state. Well, how many should they be from each state? Should it be equal? Should there be one electoral person for each state or not? And how do you figure all of that out? They use the Constitution for that. And they said that if a state like Texas didn't exist at the time, I'm just giving you a current number, if a state like Texas, which has a lot of people, compared to a state like Wyoming or Alaska, which hardly has any, okay, then that state should have more electors. Okay. That would only be fair. So today, the state of Texas has 38 members in the House of Representatives and 2 senators. 38 and 2 is 40. They get 40 electoral votes in a national election for president. Wyoming gets 3. Wyoming has hardly anybody. They have 1 person in the House and 2 senators, so they get 3 electoral votes. Do you think presidential candidates go to Wyoming?
No.
No way. They don't. It's only got 3 votes. See how it works? Now, a lot of people don't like this. They don't consider it democratic.
It's not a Democrat.
But these presidential candidates go to states like New Hampshire and Iowa, which are basically small states, because they're the first ones that have their political choices, nominees for president in the Democratic and in the Republican Party. So there is motivation to go to some small states, depending on what state they are, how they generally vote, and where in the process of choosing candidates they are. Because if a presidential candidate goes to New Hampshire, which is first on the list for nominating people to run for president, and gets no votes, they don't get any contributions. If they get a lot of votes, then the money starts to pour in. So every presidential candidate goes to New Hampshire, even though it's a small state.
Bless you.
Texas has 40 electors. The state with the most electors is California, because they have the most people, and I think it's 55, something like that. Now, the way current elections go in the United States for president, Texas currently votes Republican. It's always winner take all, except for 2 states. If you win Texas by 1 vote, you get all 40 electors. And that's up to the states to decide. There are 2 exceptions to this. 2 states don't operate this way, but the other 48 do. It's winner take all.
I heard that even though we vote for somebody, the electors can choose somebody else.
You know, that hasn't been tested in the Supreme Court. It's possible, yes, and it has happened, but it hasn't turned the election. Now, if it does, then all hell's going to close, and it'll probably go to the Supreme Court. And then we'll see what happens. But it hasn't really been tested yet. Good question, good observation. Okay, again, this is a current number. In the beginning, the representation, if you wanted to have someone in the House, you know, being your delegate, let's say you're in New York, Virginia, and the people vote for the person in the House, it was based on 30,000 population. For every 30,000 population, in the beginning, when there were hardly anybody here in the United States, you got 1 delegate to the House. Today it's 750,000. Okay. Interesting. So Delaware, Wyoming, hardly have any members in the House, because they have, and Rhode Island, they have a relatively small number of people. And therefore they have fewer electoral votes. But each state has 2 Senate votes. So Wyoming, which just has 1 in the House, gets 2 extra because they have 2 in the Senate. Every state has 2 in the Senate. Okay, I'm trying to explain this because our presidential elections are getting very controversial. They really are. And this is what they're arguing over, those electors. So today there's 538 electors. And again, they're supposed to be very prominent citizens. And you need 270 votes, electoral votes, to win. Not popular votes, electoral votes. And about 4 or 5 times in the history of America, one candidate got more popular votes than electoral votes. Tough luck. This is what counts. Whoever gets 270 wins.
This media break just makes it seem so, oh, how can another candidate win? We weren't even popular.
So election night is very exciting because the news guys, keep saying, well, Rhode Island just came in, that's, 3 votes for blah, blah. Wyoming just came in, New York just came in, and the votes keep piling up. And as soon as they hit 270, that's the winner. And it doesn't matter what the popular vote is. And in 48 states, it's winner take all as far as the electoral college is concerned. It's a crazy system. It really is. But again, they set it up because they were afraid of the power of the president, because the power of the president would be military. And throughout history, Greece, Rome, whatever, there was always dictatorships. They started out with democracy, or they started out with a republic, but eventually they became dictatorships. They just didn't want that to happen here. So they created this artificial thing called the Electoral College in the hopes that it would be prevailing. Yes, sir?
What's different between how does the president lose any sort of power just because they're elected by an electoral college versus the people? What changes? How is that better?
Be a little.
Because you were saying that the reason that they created the electoral college is specifically because they're afraid of the power of the president.
Correct.
So what's better about, how does that deny the president any more power?
Because the people who vote in the this is the theory now, I'm not saying it's, in practice happens, okay, it doesn't. But in theory, those people will put the country above their own interests, and they will elect a person who will do the same. That's the theory. Okay. Now, you can argue till the cows come home that that doesn't happen, that that's not part of human nature, that it sucks, it's not democratic, and you're right, but that's what they did, and I'm just telling you why they did it. And you're either stuck with the system that you don't like unless you change the Constitution, or you do like it, you do think it has validity, because the small states get more attention. Otherwise, if California, New York, Illinois, Texas vote for one person in a presidential election and nobody else does, that person will still win. So the president will come into office only caring about the largest states and could give a damn about Rhode Island, Delaware. Okay, follow? That's the counter argument as to why it should still stay in. You may want to buy it, you may not. Got it? Good question. So this is one way they attempted to keep that Constitution intact by having a separate body, in effect, elect the president, not the people. Now, what about this impeachment process? Again, this was the concern that the president, how do you keep the president in line? Because he's head of the military, or she. And basically, the Constitution sets out a removal from office process for the president. So it's a two-step process. A lot of people don't understand this. It's a constitutional process. It's political. It's not necessarily that the person is criminal. It's that that person has done something so wrong in office, took bribes, gave aid and comfort to the enemy, really bad stuff. Get rid of him, or that's what impeachment is about. Okay? So a majority vote in the House has to take place to impeach a president. That doesn't mean he or she is immediately removed from office. That's an indictment, it's a charge. We're charging you with something. And if a majority in the House feels that it's valid, that charge, yeah, bribes did take place, yeah, we have evidence. Okay? Then the person is impeached, that's an indictment, a charge, and then it goes to the Senate where there's a trial. The president's representatives bring forth their evidence, just like in a court of law, but this is in the Senate. And the House of Representatives brings forth their charges. The Senate deliberates. If 2/3 of the Senate decides the charges are valid, like a jury in a trial, then the person is removed from office. Not goes to jail. It's a political act. They're just removed from office. Now, later on, criminal charges might be brought, but as far as the constitutional process is concerned, strictly political. If 2/3 of the Senate doesn't vote to convict, then the person remains in office. To this day, now all federal appointees are subject to this. Judges, okay, Secretary of State, and in the whole history of the United States, only 20 federal officials have been impeached, which is amazing, and only 8 have been convicted, and by convicted, that means removed from office. You're on a federal court, you're no longer a judge. You're the Secretary of State, you're no longer a Secretary of State. You're President of the United States, you're no longer President of the United States. You're removed. Okay. And again, this is another way to keep power in check. In this case, the legislative branch has the power to remove the president. But they gotta get a lot of votes. So how many presidents have been impeached? Anybody know?
Like physically had to be removed?
Well, I'm using the term impeached. How many have been impeached?
There's a lot
Not
have been.
convicted, impeached.
There's a lot.
No, only 3.
No, because they were talking about, well, they have that been brought up to, Biden's been brought up to.
No, he
They're-
hasn't been impeached, no. There's an inquiry about that.
Yes.
Not impeachment, the inquiry. Okay. You gotta understand, these are all legal terms.
Okay.
So how many presidents, anybody know? 3. In the entire, have been impeached. How many presidents have been convicted? 0. So far. Okay. So far. But you're living in very tumultuous times politically. And in your lifetime, maybe very soon, a president may be impeached and convicted. Trump was impeached twice, but not convicted. Yes?
Who was it? The Watergate? Who was the president? That
Who was what?
was it? Was it Nixon?
Nixon resigned, he wasn't impeached.
Okay, so he removed.
He
Okay.
got out before they could impeach him.
Okay.
Officially impeach him. They were going to, but he resigned. The only president, active sitting president to ever resign from office, Richard Nixon, but he wasn't impeached. If you take 1302 with me, I'll explain all of that then. What happened. All right, everybody understand? Again, now remember, these things are in here to keep people from becoming dictators, from getting too much power. That's why they're in there. And then they also wanted to make sure that the amendment process in the Constitution would be very difficult to do. They said, here's the Constitution, and now how do we preserve those features in it, okay, that we think are very important, like the Electoral College, like separation of powers, like checks and balances, all of that. How do we preserve all of that? Well, you can change the Constitution to get rid of that stuff, but we're going to make it very difficult for you to do that. Okay? And remember, as I said, it's the longest running Constitution in history. Active Constitution. So it takes 2/3 of both houses of Congress to vote for an amendment, or 2/3 of the states. Either one of those two, either 2/3 of Congress, both the Senate and the House, or 2/3 of the states. Either way, once that occurs, it still hasn't taken place. Then, either way, then 3/4 of the state must ratify that amendment. 3/4 of the state, it's almost impossible. Okay? 2/3 of Congress or 2/3 of the state, but then 3/4 of the states have to confirm and ratify. Ratify means approve. So how many amendments have we had in the history of the United States? Remember, the intention was not to have a lot. Anybody?
17.
Good guess. Close. Let's see. Your name, sir? Zach?
Heinz Redder.
Oh, it's up there. I'm sorry. I didn't think it was up there. Yeah, 27 to date. Okay. Now, that's not a lot. And one amendment repealed one of the other amendments. One amendment was prohibition. No more alcohol in America. That was 1920. Okay. You couldn't drink. Period. And that was so unpopular that another amendment repealed it. So there's actually only 25 active amendments.
How does that come about? You're saying that there was an amendment done to the Constitution, right?
There was an amendment that changed the Constitution that prohibited the consumption of alcohol. Actually, it didn't prohibit the consumption, it prohibited the manufacture and distribution of alcohol, which in effect was supposed to restrict the consumption. Okay, and that went into effect. That was the 19th Amendment, I think. And then the 25th Amendment repealed it. That's why you can drink today. So as it's actually, even though there were 27 amendments, it was actually only 25 that are still in effect, because one repealed it, but I know. Okay.
You gotta read into that.
Questions on this? Okay, now they're debating this Constitution in Philadelphia. Hot, stinking, smelly Philadelphia. They hated Philadelphia. In the summertime, you know, it's very humid, it's hot, full of mosquitoes, swamps, all kinds of stuff. Terrible. And they debated in secret. They locked all the doors, they sealed all the windows, they were wearing wigs and coats, and they were sweating like hell. And they hated it. And they argued for 4 months, yelling at each other, screaming at each other. And this was an attempt to now create the Constitution. This was the actual process when they were debating for 4 months. And a couple of major things happened that got it to pass. Otherwise, it would not have passed. It was that close. Okay. One is called the Great Compromise, and I'll get into that. Another is called the 3/5 Compromise. And part of this objective is to, what's their role in causing the Constitution to survive, not to get voted down. So the Great Compromise has to do with the creation of the Senate. You had 13 colonies at the time, they're now states. Some of them had a lot of people, Massachusetts, Virginia, and some of them had hardly any, Rhode Island, Delaware. Okay? So the first proposal was to have one chamber, not two, not a House and not a Senate. We have 2 chambers in the legislative branch, House of Representatives and Senate. The first proposal that came up was one branch, period, and that would be the legislative branch, and it would strictly be based on a state's population. The more people you have, the more people there would be in that one branch to represent your state. So if you were Virginia, I'm just making these numbers up, you'd have, say, 20, because Virginia had a lot of people, but if you were Delaware, you'd only have 1 or 2. Okay. So 2 factions developed, 2 special interest groups developed over this issue. They were called factions at the time. Today we call them special interest groups. The small states didn't want this to happen because they felt the large states would dominate the legislature. Remember, you know, divide all of the political power. And the big states liked it. They thought it was great. And they were arguing and arguing and arguing. And it's all very interesting if you want to read about this, you know, what came up over this thing. And finally, they compromised. Remember, the whole idea was to get people to compromise. You can scream and yell at each other in the political arena, and that's okay, because power is balanced, hopefully, and the people would be willing to compromise ultimately instead of shooting each other. That's the whole idea. So, the big states finally relented, and they said, okay, we'll compromise. They told the small states, this would be the delegates, the representatives of the small states, in this convention where they're trying to write this Constitution. And we'll have the House, the one chamber, well, 2 chambers, not one. The House will be based, the members of the delegates in the House from Virginia, from New York, will be based on the population of that state. The more people, the more delegates they will have. And that's the current situation. That's called proportional representation. That's the technical term, proportional representation. The more people you have, the more delegates you'll have. Okay, got it? It's proportional to your population. Okay, questions? But we're giving something, okay, the big states. We're giving you, the small states, something. And that is, there'll be 2 members from each state. Not based on the population, just based on the fact that you have two. So, and we're gonna call that chamber the Senate. So 2 people from Massachusetts are in the Senate, 2 people from New York are in the Senate, 2 people from Delaware are in the Senate, even though there's big differences in their population. And the whole point of this, originally, and it still exists, is to keep the big states from dominating the small states at that time, and to this day. So if the House of Representatives, which has proportional representation, passes a law that the small states don't like, then in the Senate, the small states can stop it. That was the whole idea. And again, people complain, this is an inefficient government, they're always arguing with each other. The idea was to keep one branch from dominating, and in this case, the legislative branch, instead of having just one body, has 2, and they can argue with each other before a law is passed. And compromise. Any questions so far? So in this case, in this picture, I'm not sure I guess this is New Jersey, was considered a small state, and this is Virginia, which at the time had a lot more people than New Jersey. So in the House, the large states dominate, but in the Senate, it's equal. The representation by state. Any questions so far? Now, I'm sure everyone knows this, but just in case, slavery was legal at that time. You could own slaves no matter where you were in the United States. Period. It was legal. And it was legal because if you were in a state that had state legislation that said it's legal in this state, the federal government couldn't do anything about it. It was legal. If in your state legislature said no slavery, then it wouldn't be legal. Follow? Got it? So where were the most slaves at that time, now that you know that?
Texas, probably the South.
The South, right. Southerners, the southern states had the most slaves. And the reason for that was it was cheap, unskilled labor, and the South was agricultural, so they wanted more cheap labor because under slavery, you don't pay wages, they're slaves. And they have to do what you tell them to do, legally. If they don't, they go to jail. They get whipped, they get beat up, they get deprived of food. You own them, they're cattle, they're property under the law. It's horrible, and we're still paying a price for all of that today in America, but that was the law. Okay, got it? So the question was, hey, how many delegates should be in the House based on population? And how many electoral votes should states have based on their representation in the House? And the southern states said, well, our slaves should be counted for population. That would give them a lot more representation in the House, even though the slaves had no right to vote. And would give them more votes in the Electoral College. See, it's all getting very political now. And the northern states, which had some slaves, but not a lot, said, hey, that would give you guys way too much power in this new national government. So again, they argued with each other, they screamed at each other, they almost got into fistfights with each other, the northern delegates and the southern delegates. It's all very interesting, but you have to like history to get into the weeds with this stuff, what they actually said. And that's the next compromise that saved the Constitution. And it's called the 3/5 compromise. They finally decided that for your proportional representation in the House, they would count slaves at 3/5 the slave population. For every 5 slaves, you would get representation for 3 of them in terms of how we would count your population. Got it? So again, maybe it's a little complicated, I'll just put it on the board. Let's suppose Virginia's population was 100 total. And 60 of that population were slaves. Okay? So 40 would be not slaves, so they would get 40 in terms of the population. Okay? And then they would get 3/5 of 60, which I think is 20. Let's just say it's 20. So the way the population would be counted for, say, Virginia, would be 60. And that's how many delegates you would get. That would be the basis of the proportional representation. Everybody follow that?
36.
36. Thanks. So let's make it 36. And we'll make this 66. So the total population is 100, but they're not going to get 100. They're just going to get 3/5 of the number of slaves. Okay, got it? Now that's no longer in the Constitution. You can't find that anymore. The Civil War resolved that. They erased it at the end of the Civil War.
Never happened.
But from the time of the founding of this country until 1865, the 13th Amendment, that's how they counted proportional representation in the House, and therefore the number of electoral votes to elect the president. So the southern states had a lot of political power. Who was the first president of the United States? George Washington. Where was he from? Virginia, a southern state. Who was the third president of the United States? Thomas Jefferson. Where was he from? Virginia, a southern state. Who was the fourth president of the United States? Virginia. See? That's called the Virginia dynasty. So when this country started, the southern states had most of the political power because of this 3/5 compromise. Now, a lot of Northerners didn't like this, but that was the compromise, otherwise it wouldn't have been passed at all. So some people to this day call the way the Constitution was originally written a racist document. And you could make a case. And many people tried to. Okay? And others say, well, we had to do something, so eventually slavery went away anyway, But that's the way it was originally written. And, you're entitled to your opinion, however you want to see it. It's fine with me. I don't argue about those things. I just try to take what happened.
Make the best of the worst cases.
Go speak up.
Make the best out of the worst cases.
Yeah, that was Franklin's position. Franklin said, we got to get this thing done. We'll worry about it later. Otherwise, we're not going to have anything. We're not going to have a country. And others said, hey, no. But anyway, they finally compromised. So as part of this compromise, again now, give and take, what did the southern states give in return? And what they gave in return as part of this compromise was that if a slave ran away, that slave would be called a fugitive or a runaway slave because it was considered property. It's my cow. It's my barn. I want it back. And that's part of the compromise. That if they could locate, no matter where that slave ran away to, even a northern free state, that slave had to be returned to its owner. And the other part of the compromise was that the United States would not import any slaves at all, period, after 1808, 20 years hence. So you can continue to import slaves, southern states, but after 1808, no. You see, give and take, compromise. Any questions on that? Now, this is going to be a sore spot for the rest of American history in this course, up to and including the Civil War. Okay, so I'll be using terms for the rest of the course like runaway slave, fugitive slave. Okay. And that's what it means. It means they ran away from their owner by law, and they were supposed to be returned. Now, some people wouldn't return, they refused to return them, but that was civil disobedience, because there were laws in effect that they were supposed to, based on this compromise. Yes?
So what, didn't they have, I mean, when the slaves would run away, when they run toward the northern states, but wasn't there a specific line that once they crossed that they didn't get chased?
That was old, no, they called them slave nappers. There were rewards to find a slave. In those days, it cost about $1,200 for a slave, but you owned that person for life, and you didn't have to pay them wages. But $1,200 was a lot of money in those days, okay? So they would put rewards up, the owners, and there were slave nappers who would then try to find the slaves, no matter where they were, hit them over the head and bring them back. There's been movies about this. Okay. They were called slave nappers. It's a horrible time in American history, it really is. But those were the times, and we now, our hands are clean, we're a future generation, we have moral opinions on all of this stuff. That's what was in existence at that time. Most people who lived at that time didn't see any problem with this stuff. Some did scream and yell and rant and rave and try to change it. But most people who lived at that time, because slavery had been going on for centuries. There was slavery in Africa, there was slavery in India, there was slavery in ancient Greece, there was slavery in Rome. It was a historic event. Most of the time, if you fought a war back in the medieval days and earlier, if you fought a war and you captured the enemy, they would be enslaved.
Spoils of war.
Yeah, it was a normal practice. I'm not trying to justify it, I'm just saying that in those days, they saw it, most people, not all, most people saw it differently from the way we do today. Because we love to say how wonderful we are, and we always criticize the past. And 50 years from now, 100 years from now, guess what? They're gonna criticize you guys. It's just what goes on, it's part of history. Nobody has clean hands, period, unless you're the current generation and you have the ability and the luxury to criticize everybody else. And then once you're gone, you get the same treatment. But you're gone, we're not gonna hear it. Okay, that's the way it works. Questions? Everybody understand the 3/5 compromise? So these are the two big things where these delegates at the original Constitutional Convention that we're gonna, in the process of writing the Constitution, almost came to such disagreement that the whole thing would have vanished and you wouldn't have had today's Constitution. Okay, questions? So, now this document that they wrote has to be approved. And they decided the way it was going to be approved, because it's going to be the law of the land. The law of the land. They created a ratification process, an approval process, whereby if 9 states approved it by state convention, then it would become the law of the land. Got it? So you live in New York, let's say, at that time. You go out and you vote for a delegate to that convention, or you're a New York State legislator, and you appoint someone to go to that constitutional convention. Let's say it's in Albany, New York. So all the delegates gather at that constitutional convention in New York, in Albany, There might be 8 of them, there might be 20 of them, there might be 100 of them, depending on what each state wants to do. And then they debate within that convention. And then they vote. And if they vote yay, majority vote yay, that state, New York, has adopted the Constitution to establish the new national government. And if they vote nay, majority, no. Okay? So that's the process they set up. Who set it up? The delegates who wrote the Constitution. They said, let the states decide through special state conventions called constitutional conventions. Okay, got it? Not the people, yeah, you gotta always keep this in mind, not the people, whoever these delegates were gonna be and however they were appointed. Each state would decide for itself. Now, I want you to understand something. Okay? There's a way to do away with today's Constitution. If 2/3 of the states today decide to create constitutional conventions within their states, however they want to set it up, they can vote yes or no and just throw out the Constitution entirely. The way it was ratified is the way it can get killed. Now, so far as I know, 20 states have said yes, we want to establish constitutional conventions, to either do away with the damn thing or to amend it. Okay, so that's lingering out there. That may pop up.
Scary.
You know, so don't be surprised. I forget which states, okay? I can't recall offhand, but they tend to be the more conservative states versus the more liberal states. So this is the country's first national debate. Everybody in the country is arguing, no matter where they work, newspaper articles, editorials, you know, there was no television or radio or anything. In bars, you know, they're arguing. Should we vote for it? Shouldn't we vote for it? It's not democratic, it's racist, you know, whatever they would say. But it's interesting how interest groups develop over this, and this is what I want you to understand. If you lived close to the ocean, you tended to be more commercial. You were a banker, you were a merchant, you owned a grocery store. Follow? Your business was trade. Okay? And those people liked the new Constitution because it would create stability in the country. And if you're a business person, you want stability. You want $1 to be worth $1. You don't want it to be 50 cents tomorrow or $10, you know, in a week. If somebody signed a contract, you want that contract enforced in the court. If they renege, you like stability. So the commercial classes in the United States, mostly who lived near the ocean, they're in yellow here, a majority of them wanted the Constitution ratified. So that's a self-interest group. They felt it was in their economic interest to have a constitution. If you lived inland, away from the water, in various states, in green here, you were a farmer. And you didn't like the idea of having a more powerful national government. You wanted your liberty. You were suspicious of that other class, the commercial class. Why? Because they were bankers and you borrowed money from bankers and you don't like them, right? It's human nature. So farmers didn't like the idea. They wanted no. So what you get here, and from the very beginning of the history of this country, is two major self-interest groups rising up, one saying yay because it suited their self-interest, and one saying nay because they felt it was an intrusion on their liberty. And they didn't like the people who were for it because they owed them money. Human nature. This goes on all the time. Goes on today. So those were the two major groups. And then they had a little red here where they were divided. And then some areas where they didn't vote at all. But essentially, this map tells a story. Where you see green, they were against it, majority were against it. And when you see orange, the majority were for it, and it was based on their economic occupation, commercial versus agricultural. Okay, interesting, right? From the very beginning, self-interest groups. So you have a constitutional convention in each state. Once approval of 9 states occurs, then it's supposed to go into effect. So now each state's convention begins to vote, yay or nay, yay or nay, yay or nay. And there's a couple of states where it's really close at the conventions. 3 votes one way or the other. And even if 9 states had voted for it, suppose some big states that had a lot of people didn't vote for it, like Virginia or Massachusetts, it probably would have just dissolved. Because you couldn't have 9 states existing and then another 4 states who were big states not existing. They would just form a separate country. Like what happened during the Civil War, right? So you really needed all of the states, but they said no. And there were political reasons for that, which I'm not going to get into. And it was very, very close. It could have gone either way. Okay. And it's the first national debate. The whole country is debating this. And the Federalists, the people who liked the Constitution and wanted this national government to be created, favored it. They favored ratification. They liked the idea of a stronger national government. They felt it would bring stability to the country. And they felt there was no need for a Bill of Rights. Now, what the hell is that?
God-given rights, right?
There was so much suspicion about a big government emerging. Remember, a lot of people wanted power, spread out, diverse federalism. There was so much suspicion that this new national government, even though it had separation of powers and even though it had checks and balances, they'd still be too strong. They'd still come after me for taxes, right? You pay taxes, right? Okay. And I don't want it. So the anti-federalists, the people who were against it, favored an older version of the Constitution. They wanted the states to be sovereign. They didn't want a national government to have much power, if any. And they insisted on a Bill of Rights. They're very famous. There's books about this. A lot of very prominent Americans were against the Constitution, mostly in the South and mostly farmers. That was the special interest group. And they made a lot of good points, in my opinion, about what could happen, because it has. But that's 2 centuries away. Yes?
How important is the the commercial versus agricultural thing, or was that just like a throwaway analogy?
No,
Is
the commercial classes had the money and the farmers had the numbers. So you're pitting 2 different groups that have different elements of power together. One element is the majority, but they have money, and money talks, right? And the other group has more people to vote, but they don't have money, but they have the numbers. So in America, that's always been the case. Okay. Did I answer your question? Okay. So you're going to have political confrontation, and that's what we're going to talk about next time. These 2 groups are going to contend with each other in America. And sometimes one group comes out on top, and sometimes another one does. And we're going to get into that story.
Which one of those 2 groups would you associate with the Federalists versus the anti-Federalists?
The Federalists would be the commercial classes, and they're called Federalists because they were for creating this new national government. We call the federal government. At that time, they called it the national government. And the anti-Federalists were to keep most of the power in the states and not try to create a national government that they were suspicious of and feared would give too much power to itself over time and take their liberties away. So they wanted the states to retain most of the power. That was the basic argument. It's always about power, political power. Okay, so when these guys, the anti-federalists, said you gotta have a Bill of Rights, you gotta protect people's liberties, and unless that's in the Constitution, we're not gonna vote yes. So these guys promised that if these guys voted for the Constitution, they would put amendments into it after it was ratified to protect individual liberties. Those first 10 amendments to the Constitution are known as the Bill of Rights. First Amendment, Second Amendment, Third Amendment, those first 10 amendments together are known as the Bill of Rights because it gives you your rights as a citizen of the United States from this guy who's the President of the United States. He can't do these things that are in the first 10th Amendment to you. Okay? And that's the only reason it passed, because these guys promised to do that, these guys promised to do it, and that's why it's not included in the original document, it's amendments to the original document. And that's the only reason it passed. Everybody got that? So here's the Bill of Rights. These are your protection from the national government. Freedom of speech, trial by jury, due process of law. Yes?
You saying they were given from the government, but it was because
This was part of the ratification. There was no government yet. This is part of the ratification process, the debate that's going on.
Okay.
One side says, we don't need a Bill of Rights. The other side says, we're not gonna vote for this thing unless you put it in writing and give it to us.
Okay.
And that's what won the debate. Otherwise, it probably would have been shot down. Okay, so let me make sure you understand this. These are your protections from the federal government. It doesn't say anything about the state governments. This is your protection from the federal governments. You can say anything you want about Trump. You can put it in writing. You can call him whatever you want. You have the freedom to do that, and he can't do anything about it. Same with Biden. Got it? Freedom of speech, First Amendment. What's the most controversial of those 10 amendments today?
Second.
Did I hear somebody mumble again? Is it you or Adolfo?
The second.
Second Amendment. What's the Second Amendment?
I don't know. I forgot it.
No, it's up there. Somebody else. What's the Second Amendment about?
The right to keep and bear arms.
Today, that's the most controversial. Okay. All governments, you got to hear this clearly, please. All governments want to have a monopoly on weapons. They want them, and they don't want anybody else to have them, including their citizens. Okay. So that's the big debate today. The Democrat Party says this isn't an unlimited right. Okay. It's supposed to protect you from the government, okay, supposedly. But it's not an unlimited. We want gun control. We don't want people walking around with automatic weapons. We want to do this, we want to do that. But the proponents of the Second Amendment say we need to protect ourselves from criminals and from you. And that's why it's in there. So, and the debate rages today. Rages. Whenever there's especially a school shooting, whenever there's a school shooting, the Democrats immediately say gun control. Immediately. And the Republicans generally say, no, it's a constitutional right, it's in the Second Amendment, you can't curb it. Okay. And then a lot of people like me say, well, we really need automatic weapons in New York City. People carrying them around. Maybe there's some basis for gun control, up to a point. And other people say, it's all right, And we had that right from the very beginning. Damn it. And the debate goes on.
I can say we need them because, I mean, what if we're restricted on some of the more, I'd say, urban areas?
Right, but the thing government fears the most, regardless of whether it's in Russia or the United States, is having citizens carry arms legally, because you can always then use them against the Army and the Navy, and, so they don't like it, they want a monopoly. Always been the case, throughout history, that's been the case. So that's why it's the most controversial amendment today. Yes?
Does that one also give us the power to form like a local militia? I think I remember reading that somewhere.
In my opinion, it does, okay, but again, it's very debatable. Okay? Very debatable. Yes, my answer is yes. Now, if you go to another history teacher, they're liable to say no. It all depends on how you interpret it.
Why would they say no? Like, what's the?
Because they're afraid that you'd have armed groups coming, walking the streets and
That are technically legal.
and taking over the mayor's office or
Storming the Capitol.
yeah, storming the Capitol. Like what happened to them. Okay, we're done. Thank you. I want to see after class, people want to go back.